Day 7 in the Vallow Daybell trial, and what may be the last day of the trial. Erica, I said yesterday that it was a big day, probably the most significant, and then we got to today.
Today.
And
yeah, today happened.
Even bigger today. Yeah.
Yeah,
Lots more
absolutely.
to talk about tonight.
Absolutely, because we had a big day of evidence, of course, but then on the heels of that, we had the state rested its case, and then the jury, after that happened, they called their final witness. They rested. I think everyone was, maybe a little surprised how quickly we got to this point, because we budgeted, they budgeted 4 to 6 weeks for this trial. We know there's, way more to this case than what's been presented in this very narrow scope. But essentially, they rested their case just around 4 local time, so around the time when court is ending anyway. And the jury left the room. And at that point, the judge asked Vallow Daybell, who is representing herself in this murder conspiracy case. Again, she's accused of conspiring with her brother to kill her former husband, Charles Vallow. She's already been convicted in Idaho of murdering her kids. So a whole backstory there. But that brings us all to this moment today where the state rests, the jury leaves, and then the judge asks her what she plans to do. And she took a few moments to confer with her advisory council. Those are essentially who would have been her public defenders had she not been representing herself. And eventually she says, well, the defense rests too. And everyone was kind of like, oh, really? Because you've been spending time leading up to this trial and hearings trying to fight for your witness, even during the trial. Yeah. She's been trying to keep witnesses on her list and bring in an expert. So it was interesting to hear her say that. But the catch in all of this is that the jury was not in the room when she said this. So essentially she didn't, declare that in front of a jury. So she technically has until Monday now to change her mind, because Monday is the day they agreed. Closing arguments will be on that day. That's when we're going to give those jury instructions. They're planning tomorrow to go over what those instructions look like. But because she didn't say she rests in front of the jury, she could change her mind. Now, it's not clear who she may call if she does that. It's not clear if she'll take the stand if she does that. But she essentially has the weekend to think about this. And it sounds like, this advisory council doesn't want her to do this. That's why she said what she did today. But I have to think that maybe there's part of her that wants to, just given the way she's been conducting herself in the courtroom. So it'll be really interesting to see what transpires over the next few days here.
And we've had a lot of those questions about the procedural issues, meaning, does she even have people subpoenaed properly, vetted properly, if you will, by the state and the defense to even put them on the stand? That may be a factor here. So, she has argued that it's been very difficult for her to get those subpoenas out. And we've heard the judge say, I will only allow witnesses to come in if I can, if I know then and have deemed them relevant, deemed that they have actually relevant information, and that the process was followed. And so I wonder if she's left with no other option simply because of some of those procedural issues. She didn't bring that up today, but could be either way. It could be, what we don't know exactly why.
Yeah. And listening back, I, went back and reviewed one of those hearings where she's discussing her witness list. And it sounded like the only people that maybe were, not totally stricken or had problems were some of her family members, including her mom, dad, and sister. And she's referenced these people before in, some of her lines of questioning. She asked today, and we'll get into our first and only witness of the day in just a moment, but she asked, did you ever interview my sister? Did you ever interview my mom? Did you ever interview my dad? And, it made it sound like that these are people maybe she would be relying on to present her own case. But again, we'll be clear that it's not on the defense to carry the burden of proof here. That's on the prosecution. They put out their case, and that's just where we're at right now. So maybe we'll have some clues tomorrow if, once they go into that jury instruction process. This is something that's happening without the jury present. Basically, each side is going to go over what those instructions for the jury looks like. And the judge did indicate that if she does change her mind about resting her case, she needs to let him know with advance notice, because that would change the makeup of these jury instructions. So it's possible we could have some more clues tomorrow. And otherwise, we'll be on the lookout for Monday.
Yeah. And we expect those to be, that we talked about, the prosecutor, we expected or thought we might see some different evidence, presented here. Some of the video evidence that we have seen of Charles Vallow talking about, feeling like he was at risk, that she was a threat to him. And we didn't see all of the evidence we suspected we would. And I wonder if that's not because of the scope of this trial, given that it's a conspiracy case, not a murder case, but a conspiracy to commit murder, that they're being very specific about, about the evidence and really making sure that their scope is simply on that one charge, as to not create any other, I guess, complications, if you will, or complexities, keeping everything very straightforward.
Yeah. And, that leads us, I think, to the first and only witness, and technically the state's last witness in this case, who I think presented some of the strongest evidence. We see some of those text messages that they laid out, they being the state, laid out in their opening statements. And this is Chandler Police Detective Nathan Duncan, and he is the case agent on this case. He wasn't initially, but he was one of the detectives and one of the officers who responded the day Charles Vallow was shot by Lori's brother, Alex Cox, and eventually became the case agent. So he was very familiar with everything, and he was the one who really reviewed some of these phone extractions that we've been hearing about over and over throughout the course of this trial and in the hearings leading up to it. So he finally takes the stand today, and we hear a lot of, the messages and the exchanges between Lori and her brother, Alex Cox. But we also hear some of the exchanges between Lori and her now husband, Chad Daybell. And Chad Daybell, I'll remind everybody, he's also been convicted in Idaho of killing Lori's children and killing his first wife, also convicted of conspiracy there. He, again, with Lori, conspired with Alex Cox. So it's the same players in all of these cases. But again, we're just focused on Lori here. But this is really the first time we hear more about Chad Daybell in court. What did you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, this was the first time, and I think that is a key element. Of course, what we know, the jury doesn't know, but what we know is that there were just, these weeks after Charles Vallow was killed, we've seen these text messages. We've heard that there was this discussion about Ned and Charles Vallow being, a zombie, and really that his spirit not being truly Charles, being taken over by somebody else, and really ultimately coming down to a justification for the killing. And we've seen that. We heard that heard that in these previous trials in Idaho, in the case of JJ and of Tylee, right? Same exact issues. And I think that, again, very, very telling, because it goes to that conspiracy, and it goes to the fact that if, in fact, this was an element of, an issue of self-defense, if this came down to Charles attacked me, then how does that answer for all of these conversations leading up to this day? Right? That's what the jury is going to have to weigh out. And it's a great question.
And I think that, absolutely. And I think that's exactly what the state was trying to lay out with this. And, it's one thing for us to discuss this and to know that this, the dark religious beliefs are part of the previous trials. But it's another thing for this fresh jury, the jury hasn't really been exposed to this yet, to hear it. So take a listen to some of what was said.
As we get to July 14th, do we see Chad then talking about cleansing the Houston house?
Clearing the Houston.
Clearing the Houston house. Sorry, to remove the darkness he caused.
Correct.
So, who was living in Houston?
Charles.
And had you seen and heard people testify that Charles was considered dark by Lori Vallow?
Yes.
And again, we continue to see the affirmations of love.
Yes.
The cheek to cheek and loin to loin.
Yes.
Cheek to cheek and loin to loin. That was an uncomfortable moment in court today.
Yes.
How did the jury respond to that?
Honestly, they seemed like they were squirming a little bit because, of course, just to set this, I know we didn't see anyone physically talking there. That was the state showing text messages between Lori and Chad Daybell, in these moments leading up to and then after Charles Vallow's death. So really, cringy, I think some may say, cringy testimony, but these are the messages that are documented. These were real messages that were sent. And, Lori objected to some of these being introduced, claiming relevance, but I think the judge overruled that and said they could, or he allowed them anyway. So this is what the jury's seeing. And some of them were squirming around, Lori writing feverishly. This is exactly what we've seen throughout the trial. She's really paying attention to this, but we'll get to her cross-examination in a little bit, but she never brought up the messages in this way, or at least the content of the messages. And, we start to hear from Detective Duncan that, Lori and Chad were discussing Charles Vallow's life insurance policy. They were discussing him being Ned, again, that dark Ned was the name apparently Lori gave to Charles because he had been possessed by, a zombie or a Z. And they really lay out a lot of these disturbing, unrealistic, feels almost otherworldly or alternate reality that, this type of logic that Lori is presenting here, and seemingly that her brother and both her brother and Chad Daybell are kind of bought into as well. So, and again, as you said, we've seen a lot of this evidence unfold before in the cases in Idaho. And I remember the cheek-to-cheek, loin-to-loin text in that regard too. So it's it's just disturbing, and that certainly isn't all of it. So yeah, I'm wondering what you thought about how that may land with the jury.
Yeah, I mean, it is uncomfortable. It's difficult because they don't have all the context that we have, and so it's interesting to think of them listening to this just in a very limited scope, and how they relate that to some of what she has claimed. And again, while they are told not to consider it, they have heard her say multiple times these, essentially what the prosecutor called smearing the victim, and really kind of drawing into question, well, did you see these threatening text messages? Did you know he was taking my phone away from me? Clearly trying to paint the picture of Charles being perhaps aggressive. Of course, her defense is that this was an act of self-defense. There was no conspiracy here. I was at risk, and Alex, Tylee was at risk. I was at risk, and Alex stepped in to save us. So when you introduce this new element in terms of, now this gives her some insight into perhaps her mindset and her goals or her motivations, if you will, that does change that dynamic. Again, considering we have seen no evidence, and especially if no defense witnesses come into play, no other evidence is presented, we've seen nothing that would prove or validate some of these claims, which then adds more credence, I guess, or more weight into this conversation with Chad Daybell. And so I think that is certainly significant in the jury's mind, I would imagine.
And, what's interesting to me and what stands out, and I'm wondering if the jury picks up on this as well, is, seeing some of these text exchanges, it's, as if the conversation kind of flows and shifts from Charles and this plan to romantic messages. And we heard a lot of this back and forth almost in kind of like the same conversation. And I want to play just a bit more of what Lori and Chad were texting about, especially after Charles's death. Take a listen.
So I talked to the insurance company. He changed it in March. So it was probably Ned before we got rid of him. They can't tell me to whom, of course, but it's done. I'll still get the $4,000 a month from Social Security.
Yes.
So on July 18th, after she talks with Banner Life Insurance, Lori tells Chad she's not getting the life insurance.
Correct.
But she tells him she's getting $4,000 a month from Social Security.
Correct.
Now we know from Lori Vallow's text to Alex that she went to Social Security on August 12th, correct?
Yes.
And we also had testimony from Social Security about that.
Correct.
But here it is on July 18th of 2018, and she already knows she's going to get money from Social Security.
Correct.
Again, do you see a lot of additional, continuing, everyday, multiple affirmations of their relationship?
I do.
Does Chad then say, it will be interesting if he if it got changed after he had 2 bullets in his chest?
Correct.
And she goes on to respond, I don't think it could have. You can't change it after the death date. They would review that.
Correct.
And then she goes on to say again, I'm thinking Kay as well. Or he says, I'm thinking Kay as well. She probably freaking out that you got those computers. I'm going to shower and give you a blessing. I'm eager to get home so we can talk. It will be okay, my love. You are wonderful.
Correct.
2 huge, just a matter of just a few words, but absolutely huge pieces of evidence there. One, that Ned, after we got rid of him, how
Ned
else
being
would you explain
Charles.
that message? Exactly. How else would you make that make sense? And then even worse, after the 2 bullets in his chest, no, we couldn't change. They couldn't change it after the death date. You almost feel like you could present that on day 1 and then rest the case. Now, we know that's not how it works, but that feels like
No.
the most significant, significant piece of evidence that we have seen in all of this trial, and something that I don't know how you could justify or rationalize or make sense of any other way.
No, and that doesn't mean Lori Vallow Daybell doesn't try to, though, because we get into, eventually we get into the cross-examination of this witness, again, Detective Nathan Duncan, the case agent on the case out of Chandler here in Arizona. And yeah, we'll kind of back into some of the, back and forth that they have once she, starts to cross-examine him. But one moment that stood out to me in relation to what we just said was that she asks him, did you, under the course of your investigation, ever learn that my brother, Alex Cox, was a stand-up comic? And he says, yes, which we've heard before. It's, that's part of this.
Right.
And she follows that by saying, well, how do you know we just weren't joking about all of this? And the state obviously objects, and the judge sustains it. So, but obviously we've said before, you can't unring a bell. So that's in the jury's mind as well. But I also don't know if that applies to the messages with Chad Daybell, if that applies to just her demeanor and her behavior and the timeline of things that have gone on. But the suggestion by Vallow Daybell that these messages could have just been a joke was really interesting to me.
And especially considering you're looking this again at the context of these 2 people, these 2 lovers who are saying, I miss you so much, love you so much. They're having this conversation. So to think that that somehow Alex Cox is going to throw in a joke in there, or somehow, that they're going to be just, there's nothing else in the context of that makes any sense, that it would be joking. It'd be one thing if they were back and forth or having, a lighthearted interaction, but that's not the case. And so I just can't imagine that the jury would give that any credibility.
No. And it's, the obvious, like, the reason we're here is because Charles is dead. Like, if,
Right.
jokes don't often result in death, that's what happened. They said, get rid of him. They, are talking about he's possessed. We know from, past cases that a zombie or someone who's possessed, they need to die in order to set them free. That's what, that's some of these dark religious beliefs that are, again, the core of this case. And yeah, it was an interesting
Nephi,
suggestion,
right?
and not the only one. Yes, not the only thing she tried to
Nephi.
Bring up. Yes. So the story of Nephi, which we've heard in opening statements and we've discussed on here, Andrea, is, what we hear from testimony is that Nephi is, this figure in the Book of Mormon that essentially is connected to a justified killing. And we understand from messages that were shown today between Lori and her brother that she says, well, stick with me, things will come to a head. This is just 2 days before Charles Vallow was shot and killed. Like, she's texting her brother saying, stay close to me, things will come to a head this week. And then she suggests that she'll be like Nephi and he will be like Nephi too, referring to her brother. So there's this discussion that...
there's something, she's been told that, right? So again, this revelation that we've heard throughout, a lot of this idea that there was a revelation, and we've heard that Chad Daybell had these ideas and these beliefs and these, these things that had been given to him. Again, a part of that, using that, those religious beliefs as, their faith, and saying that this was told to me, that's why these things had to happen. And that's a big piece of that too, is again, that we were told that this was the right way. This was, again, justification, just like she references Nephi, almost as if we are actors of God. We're actors, on behalf of the greater good, and that we are simply almost chosen, I think, is kind of how we've understood it in the previous trials, and some of that evidence, that they were chosen to carry out the right thing, even if that meant death.
Yeah. And I think that storyline, I understand that it feels like a stretch in some ways, but I can understand why the state is bringing this in and saying she felt like this is who she was, because that's what that's what these messages are showing. And when you link it to the fact that Charles was killed and that we know that there are other people who have been killed as a result of the actions of Lori, Chad, and Alex,
right.
It's really part of this big picture here. And what's interesting is that during Lori's cross-examination of the detective, she tries to really go at him at this point. It's similar to the same line of questioning as this was all a joke, but did you really know what I was talking about when I was talking about Nephi? So it was certainly a really interesting line of questioning, and I want you to take a listen.
You had testified earlier about the story of Nephi, is that correct?
Yes.
And you said that you researched it, is that correct? What research did you do?
Well, the very basic research. I Googled who is Nephi, what does Nephi stand for. I've also, through this process over the last 4 or 5 years, have asked other members of the church just a simple question: tell me about Nephi. And every single person I talk to tells me that same story that was told by Adam.
So you did not read the Book of Mormon?
No.
You did not read First Nephi?
No.
You just asked people. That was your research?
I asked members of that particular church, and I also did an internet search, yes.
So isn't it true that you really have no idea what I was referring to when I referenced Nephi in my text message?
I can only go off of what I see. I can't tell you what you're thinking or what you're trying to relay there. But based on my knowledge and based on talking to people about who is Nephi, that is a story that came up consistently.
You relayed to the jury that it was in order to kill. You relayed to the jury.
I said that the story was the same story and similar to Adam told.
Okay, and you said it earlier that was in order to kill, that I referenced Nephi. I will be like Nephi and you will be like Nephi. To the jury here today.
Ask a question. That's a statement, not a question.
Do you have knowledge that my text message meant that at all?
No.
Are you aware through all of your investigation of this case that my brother was a stand-up comedian, Alex?
I had heard that, yes.
And that everything is a joke to Alex?
I can't speak for that.
So when you're interpreting all these text messages and making all these assumptions, half of them could be jokes and you would not know that?
Objection, speculation.
Sustained.
Were you speculating when you read my text messages?
I think I'm just reading your text messages. I don't think I was drawing any inference from them. I was just simply reading them.
Not making any assumptions. Again, just pointing at that little bit of, again, trying to create this doubt of how could you know, right? Kind of what we've talked about before, consistently wanting to essentially prove the absence of something.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that works.
And we saw some other themes that we've seen in her cross-examination before too, where she's, it feels like she's, she kind of fires. I've been likening it to like firing off questions where she goes one after the other after the other. And she really like almost raises her voice a little bit. And, it feels a little more tense and terse. And she, and then we also see the judge step in a couple times saying, nope, can't do that, or like ask a question. So he's, continuing his, criticism isn't the right word, but he's, telling her that you're not in line with what we need to be doing here. And I think he's given her a lot of space to just keep doing what she's doing. And, I feel like there's probably many points where he could have just said, no, you're done. And he's, it's a tough line to toe, and she claims that she's doing the best that she can, but she has to be, she's continually reminded of the same sorts of things over and over. So that, again, doesn't make her look that good.
Yeah, and I think you have to look at it from it's interesting, and it's difficult to kind of peel back those layers, but you have almost two very different paths of arguments that she's making. I mean, one is in essence that we're just joking about him being dead, and yet then he ends up dead. So, so if you had no idea this was coming, then are you, so you're as shocked as anybody, which then would lead you to believe, can you imagine the reaction? The reaction that we saw from her, those videos that we saw of her in the police station, of her talking to detectives, if this is really, can you imagine, just put yourself in her shoes. If let's go down that path. If she was saying, like, I was joking about it and then it happens, do you not think you're going to reference that? Do you not think that that's going to be something even more shocking instead of that nonchalant, more relaxed, yep, yes, I was there and this is what happened? I mean, it just doesn't add up. And I, fascinated to think that it could at this point be completely finished. We could have all the information. And we also had a discussion this afternoon, right? They discussed and we talked about whether or not at this point, given what we have right now, assuming that the defense rests, will the jury ever hear any of those previous convictions? That was only if she took the stand. Is that correct?
Yeah, my understanding is that they haven't. So I know we get this question a lot on our stream.
Yeah.
Does the jury know about Tylee and JJ? And I mean, they know about them, that they're the children of Lori Vallow Daybell, but they don't know that they're dead. At least that's not come up in court. And they don't know that Lori was the one who's been convicted of killing them. So it's sad and hard, but we understand that the state could bring up her past felonies if she takes the stand, because it's a point of credibility. And, they can say, well, she basically discrediting her because she already has these convictions. Sure. And in the hearings leading up to that, there was some discussion and the judge said he would limit, which felonies could be presented. And we don't know what he may have been leaning towards, because he essentially left it at that, saying, if that's a bridge we're going to cross, we'll cross it when we get there. So, it remains to be seen. Again, her inclination, at least what she said, is that this is not going to happen, but you never know. Things could always change in the next few days here. So we'll certainly see. But I do want to, if you had a point on that, but I do want to go back to finish the detective's testimony, because there was a few other points there that I thought were interesting. And it speaks to, again, the mindset of Lori Vallow Daybell, because, when she's talking about religion or asking, well, did you read the book of Nephi? Did you read the Book of Mormon? She says it with such certainty and strength in those moments that, to me, it feels like she's almost trying to show off that she's maybe more superior than anyone else in the room, because she is aware of these, she's aware of the depth of the Book of Mormon, of her religious beliefs. And it brings me back again to Idaho, where when she was sentenced for killing her kids, in that case, the judge said, just delusion. And we've seen in, an interview she's done with Dateline that she talks about Jesus visiting her and talking to her. So she is still, to some degree, or at least purports to be, in this like religious mindset and religious world that it feels like other people maybe just aren't privy to, or at least that's what I'm taking away from her energy in the courtroom.
And I think I picked up on that, and again, nuanced in it. You can't really tell because you're just trying to pick up what you can on the audio, but almost as if she scoffs at him, almost as in you don't know, do you? And there's a tone in that, and that furthers, what you're saying. I think that supports what you're saying, is that there's almost this idea of like, you have no idea, kind of a, in my world, that would be a bless your heart. You can't know what you're talking about right now. And I think that's the message that she's trying to get across. But again, I just don't think that, given everything that we have seen from her, that really has a lot of credibility, or that would hold a lot of weight with the jury when you're talking about having to weigh out, all of this evidence versus somebody, potentially, suggesting that they don't know the Book of Mormon. How does that factor into a decision? I can't imagine how it does.
Well, and I wonder, I think you probably, as a jury, you're probably I would wonder how many of them are privy to what she's talking about. And does that make them feel a certain way about the way she's rattling off some of these things that are really, it feels like somewhat down a rabbit hole. But, we also saw this same line of questioning, the same tone and the same, firing off these questions when she's talking about testing certain evidence in this case. She asked the detective, well, did you use luminol on the bat that, my husband apparently was using to try and hit Alex and Tylee and, me? And did you test the gun for blood? And they didn't do these things. And the detective clearly says we didn't do them because we didn't see blood on these items. It's not necessary for us to do all these tests. And she kind of fires back by saying, well, wouldn't you want to be sure? Aren't you the agent on this case? Wouldn't you want to know this information? And it's the tone really sticks out just as much as, his answers to the questions.
Right. Yeah. That challenging, that essentially, suggesting that clearly you didn't do the correct investigation. And we've heard the judge warn her about that, not about evidence, but just being very careful about any, inference she makes about the way that the time that it took to investigate or, different elements of this investigation. Of course, if you're talking about evidence and how it was tested, the judge has allowed that. There hasn't been a lot of pushback there, but it is that sort of questioning and trying to create, like you said, any sort of doubt that she possibly can. But even so, even if we, once she starts that, again, without any other evidence in the contrary, or without her presenting any other narrative, right, any other contradictory evidence or contradictory information, we're still left with, so what? Right? We still have that lingering question of what are you trying to say with that information? How does that play in here?
And Andrea, it was really a big moment in court. I think we finish ultimately with, Detective Duncan. He wraps up. There's maybe a jury question, which again shows they're paying attention. But wrap up, the state says we rest. This was, again, surprising in the grand scheme of things because we know there's more to this and we thought maybe more witnesses would be called. But they also told the judge that it was possible they could rest as early as today or tomorrow. So this not as unexpected as what came next, which is Lori Vallow Daybell saying that she plans to rest, but it wasn't that immediate. I, mentioned right at the beginning that the state rested its case and then the jury left the room. The judge essentially asked Lori Vallow Daybell, what do you want to do? And she took a few minutes to confer with her team. And then she at first throws forward this motion, which we've seen before. It's common, I think, in these sorts of cases where, basically she's laying out that the state didn't do its job. They didn't put out enough evidence to go against her in this case. And the state, of course, denies that. The judge ultimately denied her motion, saying, yeah, there's definitely substantial evidence here. Right. And they certainly laid it out.
In most cases, most cases do that.
It
just
seems
a procedural,
pretty routine, pretty standard. Yeah. Absolutely. Right. And then we get to the moment where she says, well, I rest too. And I think that really caught everyone off guard. And especially because, again, she made this big fuss about bringing in an expert and trying to get her witnesses there and, being combative when the state filed motions to strike that. So I want to, play out just a little bit of that moment leading up to that point in court so people can see for themselves, because it truly was a big moment today.
Looking at the evidence in the light most favorable to the state, there's sufficient evidence based upon everything from the iCloud messages from between Alex, the defendant, and others leading up to July 11th of 2019, that Alex Cox was invited over by this defendant, knowing that they were going to be having an intervention and knowing when Charles would be there and bringing a handgun over with him. The timelines on July 11th of the killing of Charles Vallow and the fact that the number of shots and the physical evidence at the scene, the statements by the defendant to Detective N-Clan that she took Charles Vallow's phone and would not give it back to him, the motive for money, and especially the defendant's motive for having an affair with Chad Daybell. All of those looking at together in the light most favorable to the state, the defendant or the jury could find the defendant guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder.
Last word. Do you want to add anything?
No, Your Honor.
All right. The standard is whether or not a reasonable juror whether or not there's substantial evidence for a reasonable juror to find the defendant guilty. The court does find that there is substantial evidence that a reasonable juror could find the defendant guilty. The court will further add that the jurors are the ones who judge the credibility of the witnesses, and it's ordered denying the Rule 20 motion. Are you going to present evidence tomorrow, either through witnesses or through your own testimony?
No, Your Honor, the defense will rest.
With a sigh, the defense will rest.
Yeah.
I thought there would be something.
Yeah, I thought so too. And maybe, again, because this was said not in front of the jury, she could come back and change her mind. But you made a point earlier, Andrea, that maybe she feels like this is her only path forward at this point because she's had so many issues with her witnesses and can't bring in the expert. And maybe she feels like she's just been backed into this corner. And, her statement came right after the judge just said, I do think the state has laid out a case where you could get convicted here. So maybe that was just a moment of defeat. And we've seen this from her before where she almost comes into the courtroom confident and, guns blazing, so to speak. And then by the end of the day, it feels like she's just been beaten down. So maybe we'll see an attitude change as we head into the next couple days here.
And not that this expert doesn't exist. I don't mean to imply that. But could this also potentially just be what we've talked about as a delusion? This almost a delusion of grandeur. If maybe what this witness, this witness that they found, or this expert, perhaps what he would be willing to present or what he'd be willing to speak to isn't what she was hoping for. We've seen that, that's been a pretty common theme here, is that she'll bring up an idea, but then there's really no meat to it. And so we could be in that situation too, where she simply doesn't have any real substantial, relevant information to draw on, and therefore knows that it's kind of futile. And for all we know, the witness perhaps said, or the expert said, I'm not willing to go take the stand. I'm not able to help you. Those are things that we just can't know behind the scenes at this point of the trial. So now we move into tomorrow, assuming that she continues to say that she's not going to present a case. We're going to be into jury instructions. And this will be the technical part, right, where they decide exactly what the instructions to the jury will be, exactly what they have to consider and what they can't consider when making their decision. And then we'll move into deliberations after closing statements, right?
Yes. So the jury is not going to be present tomorrow. This is essentially both sides. The judge came in today and said, hey, I have a draft of these jury instructions. Lori, he said, can we discuss them today? And Lori Vallow Daybell essentially said, I just got these. I get home to my cell very late, so it'll take me, some time to go over these. Can we discuss them in the morning? So that's, where that came in. And essentially she said she wanted time to confer with her team too. So we're getting started around 10:45 tomorrow morning, local time here in Arizona, for them to discuss this. We're not expecting this to take all day, but it could be interesting to see what arguments she makes, if she's more pointed here or not, because it feels like, it's over. This is it. The case has been laid out unless she changes her mind. So if, again, the judge said he wanted notice, if that's the case. So I would expect that we would possibly hear sometime tomorrow if she does change her mind and wants to present some sort of case. But who knows? Who knows at this point? And both sides had laid out too that Monday is the best day for closing arguments. And the jury was essentially told, you don't have to come back until Monday. So there's no chance, things will switch up tomorrow and she'll say, just kidding, I want to bring somebody. And then they have to call the jury and the soonest they're showing up is Monday. So that's what we're going to be looking out for.
All right. You'll be there for jury instruction tomorrow. Of course, we will be here to break that down for you, to see what happens tomorrow. And then, of course, we will bring you all of the information and all of that, those closing arguments on Monday inside the courtroom. We'll see you right back here tomorrow.